The first thing I want to say while we are recording is I want to thank Tim for once again agreeing, in fact, offering to take minutes in Etherpad. And if anybody wants to help Tim, he's already placed the Etherpad into the WebEx chat. And for Blue Sheet purposes, we should use the Etherpad for that. I see a few people already have. I believe it is now customary to ask people not to send video, lest there be a bandwidth problem. Though personally, I enjoy the video. At least under the current circumstances, there's a concern. And yes, there is a Jabber room. Just a moment. Let me get that for you, Mark. A sec. It is hang on a second. It is RFC, I'm sorry, RFCE FDP is the name of it. I'll put it in the chat here just a second. As such, I have some slides to show. Okay, question, are you seeing the presenter view or the nice big full screen?
Presenter.
We can swap that. How's that, better?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's see here. Give it a couple minutes. Now, as I am sort of running the meeting, I'm not actually following the Jabber conversation at the moment. So people should bear with me. If somebody needs to say something, just put it in the WebEx thing or otherwise speak up. Let me see next. All right. We'll give just another couple minutes. Okay. All right. We'll go ahead and get started with the preliminaries, and people can catch up. First of all, welcome to the RFC Editor Futures Program's second virtual meeting. This program operates under charter by the IAB, but based on that charter, we've agreed to note well rules. Looking at the attendee list, I see that everybody here should be familiar with these rules. So I'm not going to go through any detail here. Unless anybody has any questions, in which case I'm going to refer you actually to somebody else, because I'm not going to answer questions about this. All right, today, again, as is typical, when we run in working group style, which is how this program runs, we bashed the agenda. I'll do a very brief program introduction review because I think nearly everybody was on the last call, and I think most people. We have really two discussion points for today, but I'll step through some of what I've seen on the mailing list, and then what I'd like to do is at least get through the first bullet point a little bit. It's a very high level discussion. One of the concerns that people have raised with me is that we tend to jump right into the weeds. And so at the high level, I wonder if we could at least try to have the high level discussion. This is something where we ended things the last time. In the last virtual, I posted something to the mailing list about trying to do a poll on this, and I got absolutely no feedback. So this is sort of a bit of a prod. The organizational discussion, the topic is really about how we want capturing problems beyond just the GitHub. Is it time to start mapping out a draft for at least the problem side of it? Noticed that a number of people on the mailing list overnight said that we really aren't agreed on the problem space yet. I have to agree with that, though I think we're getting there. And so as we go forward, I'd like to take ideas from the room as to how best to proceed with the organization. I don't know how many more polls we'll do, but I think that I want to at least stake out the next future meeting. But I'm not sure I'm going to have it in 2 weeks. We haven't agreed to that. We have an IETF where meetings are being scheduled, and I want to talk about that. Let's see here. John, go ahead. You have a question. We are in the agenda part. Good morning to you.
I just want to comment on something you said before about putting the agenda together. You're getting no comments, which is that
it was on the poll, John.
I understand, but I suggest that at least for some of us, the amount of traffic on the list, especially as you mentioned earlier, out in the weeds, is just overwhelming, and not getting a response to any given poll or posting or comment may indicate overwhelm rather than anything else.
Yeah, it could be the it could be that we're also quite bursty. I'll admit to it being a little bit surprised at just how bursty. Does anybody want to bash the agenda here, though? Okay. Hearing nobody, we'll move on. So here is the various bits of program information. These slides, by the way, have already been uploaded onto the data tracker site that you see there. I want to thank the tooling team and Cindy for having made the effort to make sure that the programs can use the data tracker. The minutes from the last virtual meeting are uploaded, and from what I said at the very beginning, these particular virtual meetings are non-decisional, and we will decide things on the list. The intent was to roundtable a little bit initially. I think that aspect will probably come to an end here. There's a GitHub. It needs a little bit of updating based on the last week in terms of the conversation that's been going on, and I'll share that over the next day or two. There are a couple of extra drafts as well. Neville put out a draft earlier this week. Well, it was one extra draft, I should say. The Etherpad is already in the WebEx. It was put into the WebEx. You can see that from Tim. And Tim, I'll ask you at some point maybe to repeat that, just in case people can't scroll up for some reason. And there is a Jabber. Okay. So here's the purpose of the program. Unless anybody feels like they need to be reminded of this, I'm just going to move on because you guys have seen much of this. Here's the charter. This is basically same slide. Right, we don't have a lot of constraints on us, but we need to impose some on ourselves in terms of being able to get work done, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So the arrow here is sort of in between these two dots here, right? Seek agreement on what problems to solve and go solve them. And the reason it's between the two dots is we are beginning to see some solutions crop up while there's still a little bit of a lack of agreement as to what problems we're trying to solve. And I think some freewheeling ideas along these lines is really good at the beginning of a process, and I'd like to say that we're still really at the beginning of this process. You all saw the the various calls for calls for chairs and then input on chairs, and I imagine the IAB will be making a decision soon about adding a second chair. So let's say that we're still early in this program. There's been a lot of good discussion. I've tried to capture a lot of the ideas. I may not have captured all of them. And so that we're going to need to formalize that a bit as we go further. And I'll be looking for help in terms of and suggestions from everybody here in terms of how best to do that. On the problem space, from the chair perspective, I do see a certain diversity in terms of opinion, which is, I think, to be expected. People are pretty passionate about all of this. Some people believe that things were generally working quite fine up to a point. Other people believe that we need radical change in terms of what the series looks like or what the process is. So there's quite a diversity of opinion. And what we need to be able to do, I think, at least, is decide on an approach in terms of resolving some of that, diversity, if you will, in terms of how the series can evolve and allowing for some change while perhaps there's some change that won't occur over time. So finding the consensus for this program was always going to be the challenge. I think we're up to it. I think each of the people on this call and everybody who's participating in the group is a person of very good character and understands that consensus is something that will be difficult to find here, but we'll work to find it. From the last time, we sort of began at this point in terms of looking at these questions, and quickly it became clear that, particularly thanks to Colin Perkins, who really said, well, he didn't say it in these words, but I think his implication was that we may be working at the wrong level in terms of even going into each of these questions. Rather, I think the way that it was looked at is, should we instead ask whether the RFC should be able to lead discussion about some of these things, and should we appoint someone who is able to evolve not only the series but how we view the management of the series. So this gets us to really the sort of strategic conversation, and I really hope it will be a conversation as to how we tackle the leveling that we solve the problem. This does lead into some discussion about RFC editor qualities, right? If we're having a leader who's bringing this conversation in and bringing us forward in terms of our own thinking, that's somebody who's going to, for instance, have some understanding of our community, probably very good skills in terms of driving consensus, and of course, it's a little different from, say, just a project manager, perhaps. One of the outputs of our group, of course, is having some understanding of the quality of the RFC editor that we're going to have. So some of the discussion points that that I think I heard, and this was up to date until last night, and I'll comment a little further about that in a moment, I believe there is broad consensus that the RFC editor does not have a technical veto. That is the perhaps only point that we have broad consensus on, because overnight, I'm not so sure that we have the same broad consensus that I thought we had on whether the RFC editor has an editorial veto. However, probably this is a question that we can explore further. That is to say, I think people would agree that if a document is so unreadable that the RFC editors can't handle it, it probably shouldn't, that the RPC should handle it, probably shouldn't receive it. Braun, you have a question.
Yeah, I was going to raise that the boundary between technical and editorial is very poorly defined, and I don't think you can answer those two questions differently.
Yeah, okay, maybe not. And I think, by the way, that even though that we should have that conversation. So I think that there has been at least some conversation as to can the series evolve with amendments. This was raised early, I think, in our conversation, maybe over a month ago even, that it's too hard to make changes. John Levine reiterated that point in the last few days, and we had a pretty interesting conversation about that. I don't think that there's any consensus there at all. It's relatively, we haven't really explored it very much. People not okay. So Martin can't hear me. All right, don't know what to do about that. What we said was, okay, who would have the authority, and what would that authority look like, and what skills would the RFC editor require? I think these are questions that also need to be explored, but it occurs to me that perhaps even that question may be a little too low level. And so this is a discussion point. We had, I think, at least some question about whether appointment of the ISC is in scope. In my view, and in Mike St. John's view, it is, and in Tim's view, it is. We can, if other people have opinions, they're more than welcome to provide them. Neville put out a document, and I just captured 2 points from that document, and I'll mention a third. One of those is, should the RSC serve? And this goes to the independence of the RSC, and not only Neville, but other people have asked the question of who should have oversight of the RSC. People saw Mike's proposal and email, which he specified a structure. I want to reiterate my thanks to you, Mike, for putting that out, and also to John for sharing opinions and for following through based on our previous meeting. So those are the discussion points that I've heard to date. Does anybody have any questions or comments on sort of my observations as to what I'm seeing on the list, or additions that they want to add as important points that they'd like to cover today? This is more agenda bashing, but I would entertain it if people think it important. Okay. Given that, then what I would like to back up to is this point here. What issues level should we be solving the RSC? Should we be discussing the RSC problem? Before we do that, I'll just mention there should be phone dial-in information available in the invitation. If I understand, I can't look at it right now with all my screen being taken up, but I think that information should be there. but I can't promise it. I think it's there, and you can check the message from the administrative from Cindy. So back to this question here, which is, at what level do we want to tackle? How much power do we want to vest the RSC with? What power needs to be reserved to the community through the RFC update process, for instance, using rough consensus? So I would ask if people have comments that they'd like to make on this point, would like to share their opinions. Please speak up. I realize it's a little bit hard to get started, especially maybe early in the morning for some or late at night for others. If I ask the question, please feel free to restate it.
Well, Neville here, looking at that list, at least one of them, the question of who owns the series, I don't see that this group could possibly answer that question. Although Brian's draft had some suggestions on that, or at least there's a lot of discussion about it.
So I think actually, Neville, if people haven't read your draft, they should. Neville, you raised sort of an interesting point, which I said I was going to mention, and I didn't at the time, but I will now. You said that this program should separate from the IAB to further independence of the series, I presume. Do you want to speak to that point?
Well, this is the how did we get to this particular point question, and it seemed to me that well, as I set it out in that draft, the idea is that there are different streams who create documents and are responsible for them up to the point where they toss them over the fence into the RFC editor system. So there's a pretty reasonably firm boundary there as to who can do what. And the question of the independence question is that basically the RFC editor is the person who has to implement any changes, and I think one of their responsibilities really does need to be to support changes which the various streams are asking for within reason. But the pushback is, well, if their publications experience, the publishing experience doesn't support that, and what says that this is not something that can be done, and arguments about the borderline between should the stream be doing it, or is this something that the series editor should be settling. It's all very fuzzy. That's the problem. That is the problem.
So let me ask this question. Who has responsibility for the editorial structure of an RFC? That is to say, how it appears. Is that the community? Is that the RFC editor? Is it the streams by consensus? Who should have it?
Well, that was my point about seeing the RSE as running something like a working group to agree on potential changes that they are. So then that's how the RSE would influence such changes. And once we can see that there is agreement on changes, then the RSE gets to help make it happen.
Anybody else want to comment on this topic?
Yeah, it's Mark. Can you hear me?
Good evening, Mark.
No, it's not. I think I agree that that's an interesting potential model. in that, it might address some of the concerns that I have. But when you talk about independence, I hear a lot of people talking about independence as a goal in and to itself, and I'd much rather we consider independence as a mechanism that might get us some desired result. And if we can think about what the results we want are, then we can figure out what mechanisms we want to use. I think, if you run, for example, this function like an IETF working group, that's a really interesting idea, and I think we've talked about it a few times in different ways. But inevitably, if you talk about running it as a working group, you need to talk about how you handle conflicts, and that usually involves different mechanisms like appeal chains or whatever. And I think there are some really interesting discussions we could have around that, in that, what is the appropriate appeal chain for this potential body? Is the IAB going to be on that appeal chain? Maybe, maybe not. It sounds like a lot of people are not so sure about that. So if we don't have the IAB, what would the appropriate appeal chain be? That's the discussion, one of the discussions I think we should be having.
Other comments? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Zerk Squirrel.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah, it is evening for me, at least for the next 34 minutes. So, I think, I guess I think I'd also like to understand what the boundaries of, or perhaps the thing people are trying to accomplish with independence is. I think by my opinion, but I think also by like measurement, the vast majority of these documents are IETF technical specifications. And so like the RFC series really does have to serve the purposes that are required to have those technical specifications be effective. And so to the extent to which one thinks that the RFC series should be independent of serving those purposes, then that seems like quite problematic to me. So I guess I'd be interested in hearing what people are trying to achieve in that respect.
For those who are arguing for a bit more independence, do you guys want to comment a little bit about what it means, what accountability means in that context?
Yeah, Eric, this is Tim. It's not so much about the processing of the documents, but when I was reading 87, whatever, in 28 and 29, and they talk about it sort of extending or sort of growing the series, or growing the going out into the community, getting, sort of engaging. I was thinking, that's where I was thinking they wanted a little more independence to sort of have that ability to sort of make decisions in certain areas like that, right? Not so much the processing of the documents, but the other things where, they're expected to sort of grow what's there, if that makes sense.
Mike St. John.
I would hope you could elaborate a little bit.
I have to go dig the documents up and go refresh my memory again. But I think one of the things that are in there is wanting, I guess, I have to go back and read, and I was taking notes. I'm kind of like, I've lost my track of mind, so I apologize for that.
Okay, if it comes back to you, Tim, just ask for the floor again. Mike?
Yeah, I think we probably all have different ideas about what we mean by independence. And my particular thing is the IETF and its whole structure is so consensus driven that sometimes we paralyze ourselves. With respect to the evolution of the look and feel, the input and the output of the RFC series, I'd rather hire an expert, somebody with some skills in that space, give them the broad brush of that, and leave them to go do it. We got into this model. I to this day got kind of frustrated with the management of the IETF when one of the folks, when we were talking about the RFC series and this RFC series editor input on things, said, "Oh, she's just a contractor." And I don't ever want to have that. I don't ever want to have a conversation like that again.
Yeah, I just my reading of history is indeed that it was quite a difficult struggle for Heather to gain consensus on the series. It was really what change she got, I think, is a testimony to her abilities. But I think that the history, there is some history there that backs you up, Mike. Any other comments, Colin?
There seem to be very strong views about particular terms, such as contractor, which are possibly being colored by different backgrounds and different experiences. Certainly where I come from, just a contractor seems like a good thing, but perhaps that term has a different connotation for different parts of the world. I think we need to be careful, in perhaps over-interpreting certain statements.
Yeah, before I get to John, I think if I read if I read the list correctly, perhaps there is another consensus point hiding here, right? Which is that whoever this person is, they should be treated as a respected member of the community. Does anybody disagree with that statement?
I think that you have to be careful when you phrase that. I think they should be treated as someone from our community. We frankly treat a lot of people in our community with disrespect. I'd rather we treat everyone with respect. But I don't think that this, I continue to be confused as to why this position is so different. I understand in some aspects why it is different, but why it gets so many exemptions, I don't understand yet.
Okay, I'll go back to the queue here. John? Cleansing, sorry. And I think you're on mute still, John.
Sorry, I wanted to partially respond to Colin and then go back and then go backwards from there. We have a phrase in some contractual situations here called close technical supervision, and where just a contractor intersects with that. It does intersect with that, and intersects in two ways. One of which is how much second guessing is going to occur of relative to that person's decisions, and how much they need to feel like there's somebody looking over their shoulders all the time. The other just a contractor thing is closely related to that, but different, and comes back to some discussions at IETF last July, which is that we have a tendency to say contractor and talk about somebody as if they're interchangeable and one can go swap them out like some other person with a short list of identical and easily obtained characteristics. Part of the problem I think we're having here, and what makes this so different, Mark and others, is that there are a number of areas where the IETF needs to or ought to be doing things, whatever those things are, in which the level of expertise in the IETF community is extremely low, and the level of understanding that the IETF community, that most people in the IETF community don't have that expertise, is even lower. So coming back to an earlier comment, it's not only independence with regard to strategy, it's independence with regard to never wanting to see an appeal or an IAB or ISG group coming in and saying, well, we disagree with how you handled that English language construction, and we want to get community consensus on that, both because it's a considerable waste of time and because the community's level of expertise in that area as a community as a whole, in terms of expertise in that area, with notable exceptions, is a whole lot better at network engineering than they or we are at straightening out those kinds of problems. And that makes this role, and parenthetically a number of other activities, some very technical and some not, but requiring a great deal of expertise, which is not widely shared in the community and not widely understood, that many people in the community don't have, turn into promise for the IETF globally. And in that sense, this is not that much different from any of those other high importance, everybody has an opinion, very few people are experts area than some of the others, but also different in the sense that we're going out and hiring, which is to say, recruiting and putting on salary professionals do those kinds of things. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Because you mentioned Mark, Mark, if you want to jump the queue, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So I can't square your assertion that, you know, this expertise is so special with the fact that so many other communities like ours have done this without somebody in a role like this. You know, yes, it does require some skills which aren't prevalent in the community, but they're still apparent. I still don't know why that necessitates an exception. We don't have an exception for, you know, there's a lot of knowledge, for example, in HTTP that isn't present in routing, yet we still have routing area directors reviewing HTTP documents when they go to last call. I don't understand why this is so different. And we have other roles like the LLC, which are not, the you know, LLC director, which are not exempt from criticism or from review or oversight. So I'm not sure why this is different.
Okay, we'll go back to the queue now. Martin, please. And how are you doing, Martin?
I'm really tired, and it is only 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so there you go. I wanted to get back to some of the things that John said, and I think the root of the problem with this treating it as a fungible code monkey unit is derived largely from the fact that we build up this one individual who has a great deal of responsibility and scope, and demands quite an extraordinary set of skills, really, when you get right down to it. And we insist that that be one person. And the presumption that this is one person is sort of persistent through this conversation. And I find that deeply disturbing, because one of the things that I've been taught when it comes to building long-lasting organizations is that you try to remove those points where the bus number is 1, and you try to find ways in which you can devolve responsibilities and specialize people in various ways, so that it is much easier to find someone who has, for instance, the grammar skills that you might need in an editor, a functional editor role, as opposed to someone who's had strategy and whatnot. And project management was one of the other skills that was highlighted as well, and there's a bunch here. So I want to put that thought in people's heads, because I'm a little uncomfortable with going on with the assumption that there's one person involved.
So Martin, that's a great area to explore. I'm not going to put you on the spot now to answer this unless you really want to, but it might be sort of interesting for you to put out an approach in which you see the division of how you see the division of labor. Would you be up for that?
I have been noodling on this problem for a long time. I realize it's very difficult, but I will have to talk to a few people, because my skills in this area are not strong. But I'm willing to collaborate with people on this if others have ideas.
All right, good to know. Eric.
Yeah. So I sort of wanted to follow up, I think, a little bit on what Mark was saying. You know, it's certainly true that there are you know, skills that we might wish to have whoever entity or person who's in the function you know, they're not necessarily that common in the IETF community. You know, I have that function in my other parts of my life. You know, I have a lawyer who I hire to, like, you know, advise me on legal things. Certainly I take his advice very seriously. But I think, you know, I think it's important to conflate two questions. One question is the question of independence, the other is a question of expertise. So, in that relationship, I'm the customer, and if I choose to disregard his advice, that's my responsibility. Or if I choose to hire another lawyer, that's my responsibility. And I certainly don't handcuff myself and make it impossible to hire a new lawyer, or say a lawyer has to be independent of me. His responsibility, I'm the customer, and et cetera. And so, as I sort of indicating earlier, in this situation, the IETF is one customer of the RFC series. And I guess I don't really understand the situation in which we should handcuff ourselves and say, well, we shouldn't be allowed to have opinions because the RFC series should be independent in that respect. That's expertise, but that's a customer client relationship, not customer vendor relationship.
Thanks, Eric. Karsten, good morning.
Good morning. So I would like to point out that there are two aspects to independence. One was already mentioned, which is the authority to act, possibly unilaterally. Let's find out why we would want to do that. And the other one is checks and balances. So you cannot get by an individual or whoever holds this position. And why might that be important? And I think we all have experience with bodies that tend to talk themselves into some groupthink that makes a bad decision seem inevitable. Think IAB in 1992. So somebody had to step in and beat these people back to their senses. And what I value about checks and balances is not just the skills. Of course, you need the skills to even understand the problem in the first place and the results of actions and so on. But it's also a matter of perspective. And I think that's maybe even more important. So I would expect the RFC editor to really bring the perspective of the long-term health of the series in. So the RFC editor would not be mired into some IESG discussion that may seem some change as a good idea, but would keep that perspective open. And that's one point where I would value that independence.
Okay, thanks, Karsten. Ron?
Hi, yeah, I was a while back when we were talking about would there be a respected member of the community. The question is, are they a member of the community, same as everybody else, or does this person have special authority and special powers in some way? And I think just saying should be a respected member of the community doesn't answer that question. In which situations are they the same as every other member of the community, and in which situations are they someone with special authority who must be listened to?
So let me just go capture, I would say, at least the last three comments from Eric, Karsten, and Braun, right? If I try to reconcile them, what I'm hearing, right, is that we have a professional, and also from John, we have a professional who has a very different skill set from the one that we have. And it's a matter of how we want to empower that professional. And let me see if I'm capturing this right. And so for the people who I'm speaking of, please interrupt me if I got it wrong. Okay? From Eric's perspective, right, what you have here is a person whose advice is given like a lawyer, right? And actually, not just advice in our case, right? Maybe it is just advice. I don't know. That's the question.
Can you press mute all for a second? There is a steam engine in the background.
People, please mute if you're not talking. Thank you. You have, you have a person whose opinion, who's valued, but who's providing that opinion as a service, as a paid service. I think from Karsten's perspective and from John's perspective, maybe as well, given that this person has a different set of skills, where we don't have the where we don't have the skills. That person needs a certain amount of freedom to make changes or to run the job, to do the job, assuming the job actually has an operational aspect to it. And so the question then is, does the RFC editor really have an operational aspect? Is one question I have. Okay, so John, you're in the queue.
Respond to an earlier comment, comparing the situation with the RFC editor to the situation of a review of routing by somebody else, by somebody who's not a routing expert. Our expectation is that if someone who is not a routing expert reviews a routing document, that they will not make strong assertions about routing which are outside their knowledge range. And our experience has been that when such people do make strong assertions about routing which is significantly outside their knowledge range, the community recognizes that and handles the situation, coming back to a different earlier comment, with far less respect than one would hope, but the message gets across very clearly. But that requires that the person who is doing those reviews accepts the fact that there's some things they don't know. And our difficulty in the community with things that are well outside our IETF's, shall we say, normal mainline engineering scope, is that people do not recognize those limitations. So we end up with very long threads about details and publications management and publication strategy by people who have no experience whatsoever in that area. And nobody has in general, nobody has the authority or will to try to rein them in the same sense that somebody who was criticizing a routing document but didn't know anything about routing would be promptly reined in, because that's much more IETF mainstream. And I've gotten doubly sensitive to this over the last several months, because we've got the same problem in internationalization. We have a problem in the IETF that everybody who speaks at least one language, speaks and writes at least one language, possibly two, believes that they have the expertise to comment on things which are much broader. And that's not the only example. So it's a matter of looking at an IETF core expertise and scope in terms of people understanding what they don't know and other people understanding what individuals don't know, and pulling back on that versus the situation we've got with the RFC editor, and one which incidentally we finally got under control, I think, broad spectrum meeting planning and strategy. Again, everybody has an opinion, but the number of people with significant expertise in the issues there is quite limited. The number of people who recognize they don't have that expertise is also quite limited. Thanks.
Yeah, good point. John, before I give the floor back to Mark, I wonder if you'd like to take a stab at answering the point that Mark made earlier, which is, how do you reconcile the level of expertise and deference that we apply to the RFC editor role in this organization versus how it's handled in other organizations?
We don't have I don't think the comparison to quote other organizations is fair, because we have a problem. And the problem is we can't figure out whether we're an engineering body or a standards body or an advanced development planning body or something else. And most organizations are a whole lot more clear on that, which makes the job easier and the job description much narrower. I posted a note a couple of hours ago that many of you may not have seen yet. But one of the questions, which goes back to the dawn of the IETF's deciding it wanted to be a standards body, is whether the RFC series and its traditional role is the appropriate place to publish standards documents at all. And the decision, which was made 25 years ago, plus or minus, was yes, but that may not have been the right decision. And it may not have been the right decision for exactly some of the reasons that we're struggling with now about getting closer to living documents and rapid revision and making trade-offs between technically correct and reasonable editorially and from an understanding standpoint by a broader audience, and a number of other things like that. And I'm not sure we got that right. And I hope we can move this effort forward without addressing that question, but maybe we can't.
Okay, thanks, John. Before I go to Mark, the meeting invitation I sent was for an hour, but our meeting is actually slated for an hour and a half. So people need to drop off at the top of the hour, I'll understand, but just a clarification there. Mark.
WebEx going to turn itself off, or we're good?
Sorry?
Is WebEx going to go for the full hour and a half?
Oh, it'll go for the full hour and a half. Doesn't kick us off.
Okay. So, John, I would encourage you to look more closely at the working group and the W3C, for example. They have that tension in what they do just as much, and it doesn't prevent them from not having this role defined. They source this mostly from the community in both cases. And so I don't see that as a differentiator. But what I queued up to talk about was, listening to John, I guess, if anything, more concerned now because, the way that you described the interaction with the community seemed to be that that what you have in mind is a role that is so aloof or insulated from the community that it's discouraging interaction or feedback with the community. And I really hope that's not the case. But to me, this role should be deeply embedded with the community and should be interacting with it quite a bit and taking feedback and ideas. And that's one of the reasons why these discussions of having a working group-like function where there's an interaction between the RFC editor, series editor, and the rest of the community is really exciting to me. And if you say, well, no, we don't want that input because it causes too many conversations and it's too distracting, I think that's a really bad outcome. And I really hope we're not going there.
Why don't I give John the opportunity to respond to that, and then I'll go to Braun after that. Okay, John, do you want to take that opportunity?
I was trying to make up my mind, which is why I started to take myself out of the queue and talking jabber. This is a longer discussion, and maybe this is not the right time, but Mark mentioned WattWG, and WattWG is exactly an example of what I'm talking about as a distinction, because WattWG is as far as I can tell from a number of interactions, an organization which consists exclusively of a small cluster of implementers with little or no representation from the outside community, and an attitude problem that what they're doing is documenting existing practice rather than figuring out how to go forward, and to a considerable extent, if anybody who wants to become an implementer in that area, who isn't part of that club, wants to do that, they just have to adopt whatever it is the club has decided on, with, again, no representation of the user community. From what I was told when I was sitting on ANSI boards by their lawyers, it's antitrust bait, but that's another problem entirely. But it's very, very different from the situation we find ourselves in. And WattWG is not out there publishing documents about the directions of the technology into the future and a variety of other things like that. They're in that regard very much more narrow than our RFC series community is. And as I say, quite different. And the differences between there and W3C are more complicated and hard to dissect, but I still claim there are differences.
Okay, let me go to Braun, and then we'll get back to Mark. Braun?
Following on from what Mark said, and possibly with a narrower point of view, I've only been in the IETF for 5 years or so. and my experience dealing with the editor function as a document author and as a shepherd has been reading through the results that come back very, very closely, and in 50% of the time saying, yes, that's better, and 50% of the time saying, no, that, I don't know if it's accurately 50%, but saying, no, that actually changes the meaning and it's no longer correct. And so the process where something gets thrown over the wall and then comes back later with a whole stack of changes to format up the English, but winds up being technically incorrect, is quite frustrating. As a user, I would be very keen to see the result of this have something where there's a lot closer involvement with the authors / shepherds through the process, rather than having something come back at the end, having been rewritten to some extent.
Okay, so that's a very interesting tack, right? It would be a pretty fun, and in terms of how things operate, right? You know, that you'd have what we would call sort of an early review by somebody from the RPC. Is essentially what you're suggesting?
Yeah, a collaborative editing rather than a stage in which it gets converted from technical language to human language, but then the human language still needs to be checked over by an expert to make sure it's still correct, because the humanizing doesn't necessarily leave the description of what the document's supposed to describe still describing the same thing.
Right. So I guess if I'm trying to pop the stack a little bit there, because that's a very, very specific aspect of interaction. Who gets to authorize that sort of interaction? Is it the RFC? Is it the community? Is it the stream owner? Is it an agreement between the stream owner and the RFC? What I'm trying to get at here, right, is we have every opportunity in this group to boil an ocean, or maybe two, right? And so, and thus not get anything accomplished. And I think it's going to take time to get anything accomplished with this group. Just to be clear, right? We're not coming to a halt. We're just, there's a lot. We're still gathering trying to organize our thinking in terms of this effort. What level should that, how should we state agreements or changes along those lines? Should it be that the community writes an RFC, it goes to the LLC so that there's costs involved? I'm not going to suggest that you try and answer that now, Brian, but one of the things to think about is what would be the interaction that you would expect? What's the high-level authorization that has to be granted to the RSC, that has to be granted to the RPC, that has to be granted to the LLC? What are those authorizations that are there? And by the way, we probably don't get to grant anything much to the LLC beyond what they already have. So just food for thought. Okay,
yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm looking at the fact that in the cases where I haven't been, well, I've been involved in working group consensus, but not involved in the Auth 48 stage. What gets published might not be what I reviewed and said, yeah, that looks good. Which is tricky, because what happens if an RFC gets published and it turns out that what had consensus is not what actually wound up in the final document? So
so that is just to restate where we are today, and then I'll go to Mark. Today the area director has the responsibility, along with the working group chairs, to make sure that all do not change the general consensus of a working group, and it's a bit of a stream function as I see it. Mark.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, just as an aside, John said that it wasn't worth going into too much detail about the working group, but then proceeded to give quite a bit of very colored detail. I don't agree with this characterization of what working group. I don't think it's relevant to what we're discussing here, but if folks are interested, I'd encourage them to go actually engage in that community and make their own judgments. lot of that
Sorry. Mark, I stepped over you there at the end. Do you have a further comment?
I just said, frankly, a lot of what he said was quite inaccurate.
Okay. All right. That point, I think it's got to be taken to the list for if there's going to be a factual discussion. But if it is, my suggestion is that it be done in a manner that is directly relevant to the level that we're attempting to fill. That is to say, we don't have to go into every last detail about the World Working Group, but rather if there's a lesson to be learned there, to draw that out and to draw distinctions between the World Working Group, which are clearly factually supported, that are relevant to the position and the authority. Ecker.
I sort of wanted to I got a line here partly because your interaction with Braun, I think I found a little confusing. I think certainly, I also have had the experience of like getting documents back and being like, this appears to change the meaning of the document. And I think that's like inevitably a consequence of copy editing. I don't know what other people have had the experience of writing a book, but you get back these copy edits, and then you're like, well, I want to take these ones and not these ones, and like, and the general assumption is like, unless you're like, grievously wrong, that the author's in charge of that, at least in a book publication, that generally you're free to take whatever copy edits you please, unless, presumably it's like really, really wrong. So I guess like if I had to fix something, so I don't think this is really about like, about equities. I think it's more about tooling, frankly, which is that the current tooling we have makes it extremely difficult to like work with the copy edit, and distinguish what the copy edits are from the free formatting edits and from other things, and from nominal technical edits. And I think if the tooling were better and the processes were like even slightly better, it'd be like really a lot easier to figure out what changes were gratuitous and which ones weren't. So I don't think it's actually a question of the various equities of the RPC and the authors, but really just a matter of like having a tool chain, which is like not terrible. Which, like, just to be frank, ours is.
Okay, I apologies, Eric. You said the last sentence, the end of the last sentence, I couldn't quite understand. Can you repeat it?
Having a tool chain, which is not terrible, which, to be frank, ours is.
Okay, so let me turn that around, right, and ask: is the RSC responsible for deciding what tool chain is used, or is the community responsible?
Well, I guess, I think you shouldn't be surprised by my answer, which is that we're the customer, and so while us dictating the exact look of everything is not a great idea, generally our assessment of what is good and what is bad ought to be what dictates.
So let me ask the question: is the accountability there? One is that we sit there and we say we sit there and we have to approve or disapprove RSC decisions on almost a case-by-case basis. That's obviously something that doesn't scale, right? The other is that we allow the RSC to make a great many decisions, and if they get a bunch wrong, we go get a new RSC. Where do you set things on a spectrum?
Well, I mean, I think again, like, this is in this particular question of tooling, this is like a pretty, a pretty common kind of customer vendor relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And there's there's a fair amount of variation. So Mozilla uses GitHub, and like we have a remarkably little control over what GitHub does. And if we get really tired of GitHub, we just like go do something else. On the other hand, we have other things that we have. We use Fabricator, and we have somewhat more control of what Fabricator does, because we're bigger compared to them as compared to GitHub, and so we can get them to do things for us. So I think there's sort of like it really depends. I think in this case, I would expect that since we're the only customer, or one of the four customers, I suppose, but we're really by far the largest, we'd have like quite a bit of control over what the system did, and we would have firm an input on that process. The usual procedure is to delegate some section of the system of the people, the community or the company to go deal with that. In this case, I presume it would be, whatever, something delegated by the ISG or the LLC.
So if unless I miss my mark, the Ecker's comments just converged with what's going on in the WebEx chat, right? And if people don't mind, that I think the key message that I'm seeing in the chat is that what we're talking about is trying to understand the delegations that occur versus where the customer has to make decisions. So I think we're going to need to be somewhat more clear on. Would that be a fair statement, Eric?
Yeah, I think certainly has to be clearer. Yes, absolutely.
So we're not talking about, it's not really about, so framing it as independence is probably the wrong way to frame it, but framing it as a delegation of authority, and where here's what we delegate and here's what we don't. I think this is something that we'll spend some.
I guess I'm sort of like, I guess I want to resist this sort of delegation of authority. You know, in a typical customer vendor relationship, you say we have these requirements, and like you have this product which like may or may not meet these requirements, and like at some point we're not going to buy that if it doesn't do the job. Now, when you have a long-term relationship with someone, they're a long-term vendor. There's like a bunch of back and forth about that. But I mean, it's not like it's weird to sort of call it delegation of authority. It's saying something a little different.
I understand what you're saying. Okay, we have actually drained the queue. Before I move on, does anybody want to add any additional comments? What we've been talking about here is really the relationship that the RFC has to the community. I think this has been a pretty good discussion. But now I want to sort of change tact before I do. Does anybody have any final points on this? All right. Hearing none. So what we have been talking about, I've been trying to capture as many ideas as possible that have been crossing the list, and we've been covering a fair amount of ground. But I think from an organizational discussion, it's probably time to start formalizing sort of a problem solution set of documents. And the way we tend to do that in the IETF is through a draft. And what I'm thinking about at this point, and I haven't put this out on the list yet, but I will probably, in the next day or two, is that I think it's probably a good idea for us to use at least an internet draft to capture problems that we agree we're solving. And that might evolve into the solutions document as well. But I'll probably want to look for, do a call for an editor, and I would look for an editor that has a pretty neutral and high-level view. But I'd like comments before I'm not going to do that without the group's agreement. But I'd like comments about the idea. If people agree that's an approach. People understand, or are there any concerns with that approach? Okay, I'm not hearing any, so I'll put that idea out on the list. We'll move on to future meetings. I think we need a little time to sort through the comments that are going on the list to develop some of the problems, and I'm not quite ready to schedule yet another interim. What I propose to do is that we get into the queue, as it were, for a meeting at the IETF in the virtual IETF, the virtual Madrid IETF, if you will. So we'll get some time there. If the group decides that they'd like to do another virtual between now and then, we can have that conversation online, but I'd want to make that decision pretty quickly so that we can get it scheduled. And so that's my proposal. Do people have comments or thoughts on that? Then,
Mm.
Neville, sorry, you trying to get in?
Well, I was just going to say, what's the date for IETF 108?
I want to say it's the last week of July, so it's about 2 months from now, or a little less than 2 months.
Oh, okay. Well, so my guess would be another one of these WebEx sessions after about halfway towards the next IETF.
Okay, thanks. Jay just put the dates in. Okay, if people want, I'm certainly very happy to schedule it. Well, I want to make sure we have a little bit firmer agenda, and it will probably be more of a formal group meeting at that point to try and make decisions on some of the problems. I think we've had a good back and forth these last couple of meetings, and now probably it's time to try to solidify a little bit as to what which problems we're going to solve, how we're going to view the RFC. Is it going to be as a customer relationship, very much the way Eckert described it? Is it going to be something else? And I'll admit I haven't been able to follow every last bit of the chat that's going on. And I think people are going to want to review that. But if we're going to have that meeting, I think as we go on for list, I think we should now begin to zoom in on making some decisions about the scope of the role and how we view it. I think that's probably the high level point that needs to be resolved next. So with that, we're to any other business. Any other business? Okay. Thanks to those who stayed up very late and to those who got up very early for joining, and for everybody else for participating. And I'll see you on the list. If you haven't signed the blue sheet, please do. Thanks very much, and have a great day, afternoon, evening.
Pleasant evening. Thanks, everyone. Bye.